My name is Anke Rasper. I'm with the environment team at DW Deutsche Welle, the international broadcaster of Germany. And I'm very happy to moderate this event because this is a topic I'm feeling very strongly about. Our lecture today is highly relevant. We're looking at the limits to growth and the limits to growth report 50 years ago, and the crucial question whether we as humans will actually manage to make the Anthropocene sustainable. 50 years ago, the Limits to Growth report published by the Club of Rome was a wake-up call and a turning point for environmental policy. The report itself was pretty gloomy, and even though on many accounts things did not develop as the projections predicted, the impacts of human activity on the planet in the past half century have caused huge damage to the global climate and ecosystems and are increasingly threatening our very existence. Today's event is the first in the series of lectures titled 50 Years, The Limits of Growth, Prospects in 1972 and 2022, and that will look at various central issues of the report in the current context. And this lecture is organized by the Bonn Alliance for Sustainable Research with two of their partner institutions, the German Development Institute, DIE, and the Center for Development Research, ZDF, both based here in Bonn. And the Bonn Alliance's scientific director, Professor Jakob Riener, will very shortly introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker, in just a moment. Let me just make a few organizational notes. Right after the lecture, we will have two discussants responding for about 5 minutes each to the input from the lecture. And then all of you in the audience are very welcome to ask questions, either here in the room, or if you're an online participant, please write your question in the chat. And finally, a brief reminder about audio discipline. We're all very used to hybrid sessions, so please keep your mic off when you're not speaking. All sound in this room comes via the table mics. If your mic is white, that means it's off. If it's green, it's on. Very easy to remember. So for now, please keep our mics off. And now it's time for Professor Riener. Please, the floor is yours.
So, dear colleagues and friends, a warm welcome also from my side. Very nice to have you with us online and in physical presence here. There are, as the moderator has said, around 250 people registered online. So there is a huge crowd online, and we are around 30 inside here. The idea for this meeting, for this talk by Professor von Weizsäcker goes back quite some time. The idea and also much of the work actually we did towards this meeting has also come from our colleague Andreas Stamm at DIE. He unfortunately can't be with us. He's suffering from some recurrent problems from a sports injury, and that made it impossible for him to come here. So let me just join all of us to wish him all the best for a good recovery. It's really a pity that he can't be here now. When we started to plan the conference, of course, we had no idea about what the corona regulations would be. So we kept the tables a bit at distance, and we decided to keep it like this, even if we are now, fortunately, may be without mask. So although Andreas can't be with us, DIE is very prominently represented by the director, Professor Anna-Katharina Hornitsch, who is one of the discussants. The second discussant is Professor Martin Keim, one of the directors of the host institution here, the Center for Development Research, and also very instrumental in the preparation of the conference has been the Hochschule Bonn-Rhein-Sieg, University of Applied Sciences, with represented by its president, Professor Hatmutini, and also United Nations Universities with us on director level, Xiaomeng Shen. Very happy to have you all here. Now, the report to the Club of Rome in 1972, I think very many of us were not even yet alive when this report was published. I was 14, a boy that could not imagine that there were any ecological problems at this time. And now we are all alive, and we are very happy to have Professor von Weizsäcker with us. Professor von Weizsäcker has not just been an observer and a researcher in this field of Club of Rome relevant themes, but he has been an agenda setter. And he has not been only an agenda setter in research, but he has been an agenda setter in management and also in politics. It would take too long time, I think, if I would just going to list up all his position. But let me just pick out some to show the width of his spectrum. Professor von Weizsäcker originated as a physicist, but then focused on environmental themes. After a professorship in Essen and in Kassel, where he has been the university president for a few years, he served in management positions in UN organizations and in European organizations. And then he was the founding director for the well-known and reputed Wuppertal Institute. So the Wuppertal Institute, as we know it, actually has started to grow under his auspices. And then 1989 to 2005, he was a member of the federal German parliament, the Bundestag. And most important, I think, for today, he has from 2012 to 2018 served as a co-president of the Club of Rome. So I think this is the most clear way to show how closely he's linked to these themes. So it would probably be really hard to find anybody who would be closer and more credibly actually positioned to talk about today's theme. Professor von Weizsäcker, we are really deeply honored that you are here. Finally, you had big troubles to reach us by train today. Now you are here, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, dear Jakob. I thought to very briefly introduce you to the origin of the book, The Limits to Growth. I used to know them all, I believe, except William Behrens. And for me, the best contributor to the book was the wife of Dennis Meadows, Donella, usually called Dana Meadows, and the supervisor was Professor J. Forrester of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But there is some origin behind or before the writing of that book came about. There was a fantastically successful Italian businessman, Aurelio Peccei, who was troubled by what happened worldwide. You know, in Czechoslovakia, there was an uprising against communism. In the West, there was an uprising against capitalism, evidently. And in places like the Ruhr area, not far from here, people were annoyed by the smoke. I was living in Essen for a couple of years, and my wife and I learned that we are not supposed to hang our washing outside because it would become dark. And the same, more or less, in Japan or in America in Pittsburgh and in the Rust Belt, etc., etc. And people began to understand that government was not capable of handling all these things. So Aurelio Peccei thought, I'm curious to know about the predicament of mankind, as he called it, and if we could, perhaps using new mathematical instruments, predict the predicament of mankind. And then he organized a conference with some 30 people who were systems analysts, including Eduard Pestel from Hanover University and Jay Forrester, and nearly 30 others. And they got together for a day at a conference, and Aurelio Peccei was not satisfied. But that was not good enough. And then they sat together with some of those elite people, including also the Austrian Erich Jansch, who was an astronomer, but also interested in complex systems. And on the walking way from the conference to the, I don't know what, dinner table or whatever they had, one of them seemingly said, well, in effect, we are a club. Let us call it a Club of Rome. And that they found quite amusing and quite attractive. So since that time, in 1968, there was the Club of Rome. And I was learning from other people, intellectuals, that there exists the Club of Rome and they are doing interesting things. But that was not the beginning. It was only the prelude. And then they sat together again a year later or so, and Jay Forrester was present, and half a dozen more. And Forrester said, I have developed a new mathematical tool, which is called, oh, what was the name? Dynamo. And Dynamo could serve to predict the predicament of mankind for the next 150 years. And then Aurelio Peccei was delighted and said, okay, you do that at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And then he picked those other 4 people here, all living there, but the one on the left-hand side was from Norway. He was a PhD candidate, Jørgen Randers, and the pair, Donella and Dennis Meadows and William Behrens. And there were a few others, including some Germans. And they began to use Dynamo for predicting the fate of mankind. And that is essentially the substance. And the core picture, which has been multiplied 1 million times in the world, is this. They had 5 parameters: natural resources, food, population, industrial production, and pollution. And they said, for instance, the more industrial production, the more pollution you will have. Empirically, this was absolutely correct. So the Ruhr area was full of pollution because it was full of industry, period, you know? And they had a qualification, a qualifier for what would we call resources. It is the kind of resources that we want and that are financially available. And then such kind of conditions they put into the dynamo. And the result was this. Resources would more or less disappear. Population would increase. Food would definitely have to increase, but would then go down. And pollution would grow with industrial production. And that for, well, 1970 to 2100, so 130 years. And this was the core picture of the book. And it scared people. Because then the falling down of the population curve essentially meant that people were starving, because also food was in demand and not in supply. And people began to wonder what exactly it is. I believe the term, the limits to growth, had not been there at the time when they created the dynamo curve. That came later. And people began to interpret what the figure was telling. And it was telling that there are limits to growth. For instance, to have enough resources. It was actually quite wrong, this blue curve, because in the meantime, the technologies of discovering resources and of extracting them and of refining them and combining them and all the rest was additional technological progress. So the blue curve is simply wrong. I mean, it was years before the fracking idea, but fracking is one example of the thing I was just telling. Okay, so that was the story in brief. And there were, of course, many new reports to the Club of Rome. And the team of Dennis and Dana Meadows made updates, but the two mistakes which I mentioned, the strict correlation between industrial outputs and local pollution and natural resource collapse, stayed there, which was a massive systems theory mistake, period. But they never acknowledged that, which is a pity. Nevertheless, I very much liked Dana Meadows. I met her in Madrid at a conference of 3 days and thought, oh God, she is really clever. But seemingly, Dennis did not really listen to her. I mean, she told me that there are some wrongdoings in it. Okay, unfortunately, she died much too early. Okay, and then as Jakob has said, I was at some stage asked to be first a member of the executive committee and later of the president of the Club of Rome. And so was my Swedish friend, Anders Wickman. And we felt that the status of the follow-up to the limits to growth was not really good enough. I mean, in 1990, roughly, the Club of Rome had done another great report, which I found excellent. It was called The First Global Revolution, which was after the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the beginning of globalization. So, but then we still felt economics has not been improved by the collapse of the communism. It became a dogma of markets are more important and better and more intelligent in discovering new opportunities than governments can do. So it was an anti-government rush after 1990, which was a huge mistake. Okay, and then Anders and I felt we needed a new approach. And we called it Come On. It had 3 parts. Part 1, come on, don't tell us the current trends are sustainable. They are not. And second, come on, don't stick to outdated philosophies. And the third part was, come on, join us on an exciting journey towards a sustainable world. I mean, you know, the term come on has 2 different meanings. And we sort of used that as a joke in a way. But it was interesting. The perhaps most significant difference against the limits to growth was that we listened to the earlier chief economist of the World Bank, Herman Daly. He was also a pioneer in greening economics and got the Alternative Nobel Prize for it. Unfortunately, not the new Nobel Prize, but he was great. And he said, we better distinguish between the empty world and the full world. Those are 2 very different animals. And much of the European history, but also of the Chinese history or the South American Indians cultures, etc., were all developing during the empty world. But the full world, which later was called the Anthropocene, is a disaster. But nobody says so, because it was the result of growth. And growth was the best anyway. Did you know any politician, any journalist, any businessman or so who would not say growth is the best? You know, you know them, all of them. But Herman Daly said, no, it's wrong. The full world, which is called the Anthropocene, on the left-hand side, you have 12 little pictures. All of them, except for the world population, is economic growth, and some of it is exponential. And the green pictures are the suffering of nature. And the most scary thing, which is not in that earlier picture, is a relentless increase of global warming, with fires and droughts and cyclones and wildfires, etc. And then one thing normal people don't know, but physicists and oceanographers know. Roughly 90% of the heating occurs in the water, in the oceans, and only 10% in the air and the atmosphere. We keep complaining about the atmosphere. Nobody complains about the oceans. But that is something, meaning that the real scare may soon be the rise of the seawater table. From an Italian school, Atlante Geografica Moderno, I got this picture. During the last ice age, Italy was a lot larger because the seawater table was low. But during the last real hot age, 2 million years ago, in the Pliocene, Italy was only half the size. And now imagine what that means for the rest of the world. It's not only Italy. Here is Asia. There are 50 cities of more than 1 million people. And all in all, it is 800 million people living essentially directly at the coast. And now imagine a rise of the seawater table. That's a disaster, isn't it? Now coming back to the economy. In a world of continued GDP growth, we must realize that growth so far goes with carbon dioxide emissions in the 8 relevant economic sectors. So, for instance, traffic, transport, or agriculture, or machine industry, or trade, for that matter, and buildings for housing. And in each one of them, the contribution of an individual human being to the gross domestic product, from left to right on the 8 pictures, means low GDP contribution is poor and high is rich. As simple as that. But the terrible thing is that from bottom to top, you have the per capita CO2 emissions. And it is exactly a parallel curve, meaning if you want growth, you want global warming, period. Yeah, but nobody would admit that. Nobody would admit, you know? And part of my new book, it's unfortunately so far only in German, So reicht das nicht, was wir in der Klimakrise jetzt wirklich brauchen, is a new economy. Because the old economy doesn't tell. And we need international climate policy. I was irritated by the fact that during the campaigns of 2021, the reasonable parties all bragged with climate policy. Very good, fantastic, and we absolutely have to do that. But if you looked at what they wanted, it was all domestic. A little more windmills, electric cars, and less meat eating, and all these things. You know all that jargon, you know? But then the carbon dioxide percentage of Germany, of the world, 100%, is 2%. So the idea in loud speak, particularly by the Greens, we will reach the 1.5 degrees goal, is crazy, totally crazy. Even if we get to the point where you could say Germany does what the whole world should do, and if it does, then perhaps we have a chance of getting the 1.5 degree. But if Germany does it with these 2% and the rest of the world does not, we have lost the game. But nobody would admit that. Or have you ever heard I mean, they are so proud of additional windmills that they think, why should we worry about Thailand and Brazil, etc.? You know? So even our mental political culture is rotten. We don't realize what the real problems are. Okay, so much for that picture. So it's an unfortunate message, I have to say that. What we absolutely need is decoupling growth from heating up climate. That is the real agenda. Has relatively little to do with the additional windmill here. So what can we do? Okay, we can build coastal dams so that Hamburg would not go down, fine, but extremely expensive. Stop coal burning, yes, fine, but as we know, the Lausitz and Rhineland, and so they don't like that. Or the electric motor cars, yes, okay, but it's essentially for the rich. Or modest lifestyles that are not exactly popular. All this is on the daily language about climate. And it's not wrong. But is it solving the problem? My assumption is no, it's not. But expanding solar power, that's different from windmills. Absolutely, yes. I come to that later. And an efficiency revolution. Getting more human welfare from 1 ton of ores or of 1 kilowatt hour or whatever you have. So why am I emphasizing efficiency? Well, a 5-fold increase of efficiency is feasible soon. And we guess at the Club of Rome that the 20-fold increase is possible. I wrote a book together with an Australian team called Factor 5, which essentially demonstrates that for the 4 most important parts of our economy, a 5-fold increase of efficiency is available. And the 4 sectors are buildings, industry, transport, and agriculture. And for all of them, we show, for instance, agriculture. Drip irrigation is more than 5 times better than the current way of watering the fields, you know? That's one example out of 1,000 examples that you could construct. Now, that is from my training as a physicist. I mean, if I talk to people less of IQ than the people here and say a 5-fold increase is possible, they will say, no, you are crazy. It's not possible because everything that is available for efficiency is long, long done. So that's the usual. And to destroy this belief, I have Mount Everest. Okay, look at the mountain. It's quite fantastic. And then you imagine a bucket of water of roughly 10 kilograms weight. And now you tell me, with your physics education, how many kilowatt hours would you need to lift that bucket of water to the top of Mount Everest? Do you have any guess? I mean, when I was in California, I was dean of the Graduate School of Environmental Science and Management in California, in Santa Barbara. And I also gave lectures, and I also showed this picture. And I got answers from these very highly educated students between 1,000 and 10,000 kilowatt hours. And I always said, no, no. There came a different offer. I said, no, But what is the right answer? Well, the right answer is 1/4 of a kilowatt hour. A kilowatt hour is a gigantic powerhouse, but we waste it no end because it doesn't cost a thing. I mean, I'm asking then the students, who of you would be willing to climb Mount Everest and deliver that bucket of water for a honorarium of, let me say, $3 or so, if the 1 kilowatt hour is $12. Nobody would. Of course not. But we have to get that in our brains, that the kilowatt hour is worth a lot more than we typically think. That is the far end of the efficiency story. But now comes the next topic. It's solar energy. Well, I was quite proud when I was member of parliament, and my friend Hermann Scheer came up with the crazy idea of a law for renewable energies, the Renewable Energies Law. And with one condition he insisted on: complete compensation of the costs of producers of renewable energies and getting that energy into the grid, in order to make the grid ever greener. That was the idea. But then evidently, as a good parliamentarian, he went to the responsible minister of economics, Werner Müller. And he said, no, under no circumstances, because if 80 million people begin to cover their houses with photovoltaics, and a kilowatt hour of photovoltaics costs 2 Deutschmarks, €1. Der Staat wäre pleite. We couldn't pay that. Therefore, I'm against, period. And then Hermann Scheer came to me. He said, Ernst, what do we do? What can we do? The minister is not willing. And then we had a chat of 5 minutes or so. And then I said, look, let's go to the whip of our party, the Social Democrats, the chief of the SPD membership. His name was Struck at the time. And we said to him, we want a discussion and an opinion poll over the Renewable Energies Law. And he said, well, you will know that the Ministry of Economic Affairs will never accept that. But if 2 members of my faction come and want a new item on the next agenda, I will say yes, okay. And then it was arranged to 3 or 4 weeks later, and Hermann Scheer gave an absolutely brilliant talk in which he explicitly referred to what the minister had said, namely that the full compensation thing would be quite expensive. But, he said, if more and more and more and more and more people do it, you will get the economies of scale. So it would get cheaper. And then we had a discussion of 1 hour, and then the opinion, and some 2/3 of the faction said, yes, we want it. And then, surprisingly, the chancellor, who had been listening all the time, stood up and said, it was Gerhard Schröder, and said, we have discussed the Renewable Energies Law draft, and we made a decision with sufficient majority on one side. So this is now the draft law by the Social Democrats. It's the opposite of what people now say over Schröder. He was a great chancellor, I have to say. He avoided us entering the Iraq war and many other things. What he does later with the Russians is a different story. That was not during his chancellorship. Okay, so the renewable energies laws was soon understood by the Chinese and many other countries. They realized, oh, that is a fantastic idea. So 5 years later, all the photovoltaics industry was in China, all of a sudden, which was bad for Germany, but good for climate. And we then, I mean, Eike Weber told me, he was the director of the Fraunhofer Institute for Renewable Energies in Freiburg. And he told me that on balance, Germany is still creating more jobs than earlier on renewable energies, because we do systems selling what you could do in Cameroon or in Venezuela or in China or so. And we made a lot of money out of that. Okay, so actually I have to explain to you, before the year 2000, which is roughly here, before that, there was also a running down of the price. That was the result of the oil crisis, because people began to realize it's not only oil, we should also develop solar energy. And that, but it stagnated after a while. So evidently people now think of electric cars, and they are available. The trouble is that worldwide, we have some 1.1 billion internal combustion cars. And now the guess is, how many of the owners of those are willing to scrap their car and buy a new electric car? And my extremely optimistic guess is 15%. I believe it's rather in the vicinity of 5%. Hence, we absolutely need climate neutral internal combustion cars. But if you tell that a German physicist, he says, no, by definition, this can't go, because the fuel is always fossil. And so you are a liar. That's not correct. A climate neutral internal combustion car means that you use that very cheap solar energy for splitting water, the water molecule, into oxygen and hydrogen, and then bring that green hydrogen together with carbon dioxide chemically. And then it's one molecule, and the molecule is called methanol. But it would be a climate neutral fuel, climate neutral methanol. And that would help us to continue the ownership of combustion cars, but with fuels that are climate neutral. Now, a different story now. We need to phase out coal burning, okay. But while we sit here and chat, some 400 new coal power plants are under construction or planned worldwide. So that is the other part of the story of our producing 2% of the carbon dioxide. And evidently 90% of them in developing countries. In South Africa, in India and many other countries, this is the big business still. So we need to find a ruling, a deal, making it profitable in the developing countries to phase out coal. It's not the case now. Now it's the opposite. But how do we do that? For that, the German Council for Global Environmental Change has developed a so-called budget approach and gave it to the Chancellor Angela Merkel in 2009 when she was on her way to Copenhagen to the next climate conference. And the idea was that all countries of the world will obtain identical budgets or permits for carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gases. But the old industrialized countries, red colored, have already eaten up all their permits, more or less. And they would have to go to the developing countries buying new permits. And if we would do that, all of a sudden, the economic calculation in developing countries would change. This is the Indian economics minister, who is, I believe, the strongest planner of coal power plants of the world. He would all of a sudden say, oh, that's interesting. We would become richer if we burn less coal, because then that will free a lot of permits. And those we can sell to the French, to the Germans, to the North Americans, to the Japan, etc. And we would become rich. So given the fact that in the meantime, solar energy is fabulously cheap and energy efficiency is available, why not shift and phase out coal? So that would be the great idea. Mrs. Merkel went to Copenhagen, but Russia and India and even China and South Africa and Venezuela and Colombia, even USA and Canada were extremely skeptical. So she put it back into her drawer. It was more or less forgotten. But now I say, in this book and otherwise, we absolutely have to revive this idea. Otherwise, we cannot make new carbon neutral atmosphere. Okay, evidently the budget approach figures strongly in our book. And another element in common is the ping pong idea for energy efficiency. You should raise energy and commodity prices or carbon dioxide prices in proportion with the documented efficiency increases in the previous year. so that the average monthly costs would remain stable, essentially. And the proposal is meant to emulate the ping-pong dynamic of the Industrial Revolution. This left-hand picture happens to be a period of 50 years in America, where the increase of labor productivity went up absolutely in line with the wages. So, rise productivity, rise wages. And nobody would complain, except for some peasants who said, can no longer afford the expensive help people. Okay, but all in all, it was a fantastic success story, leading to a 20-fold increase of labor productivity. And you remember now what I said about Mount Everest? A 20-fold increase of energy efficiency. That's a joy. It's not impossible at all, but it has to be made productive for your financial side. You must become richer by doing it, not poorer. One other thing about the Anthropocene, which I had originally planned to have somewhere else, is in the Anthropocene, the total body weights of land-living vertebrates is 67% animals that we essentially slaughter and eat. And 30% is the body weight of people, leaving 3% body weight of all wild animals combined. All elephants are included, and all walruses and other such heavy animals. Meaning, essentially, the Anthropocene means eradicating wild animals. Now, a brief mentioning of the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030. This is the picture you know, of course. You have seen this 100 times. In reality, looking at the SDGs 1 to 11, it is a massive growth agenda. And to call it sustainable is a lie. It's not. There are, of course, 3 compromise Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs: climate, oceans, and biodiversity, 13, 14, 15, but essentially they go under. The real picture for the same story is that one. You have the basis, which is the environment. Oceans, I mean, how can you feed the people if the oceans are gone? Or the fish in them. Climate and the diversity of animals and plants. So if we protect those, then we have a chance also for the growth agenda. But then you have the so-called impact investors who tell themselves and the audience they are doing the right things with their investment. And now I looked at the 17 SDGs and how much of the impact investors' money go into climate and the other environment. Nothing, essentially. Essentially, all goes into growth. Essentially, health, then education, why not? Okay. Affordable energy, meaning more. Sustainable cities, food, and quality education. You know, those are the big ones, and the others is minor. Okay, and then we looked at 40 years of the term sustainable development. It was first introduced in the World Conservation Strategy book by UNEP, IUCN, and a third group. For the first time, the term sustainable development occurred. And essentially, it was meant to copy what German forestry had discovered 300 years ago. Never use up more than will grow again. So this was essentially an ecological plea. But then, as history went, ever less of nature was left, and ever more of economic growth was coming. That's the situation. So the 2030 agenda is essentially on economics. The current trends in the full world are in no way sustainable. In our book, Come On, we also got quotes and stories from the Pope in his encyclical Laudato Si, where he declares that the current economy of greed, relentless competition, and wild acceleration is destroying our common home. And that led us in the Club of Rome to the desire, the obligation of creating the core of a new enlightenment. Of course, the old enlightenment was absolutely great. I don't go into details. It made industry possible. This is per capita growth. And only after the Enlightenment, the early Enlightenment in the year 1800 or so, you got the big growth. But Europe legitimized conquering the world, colonialism, etc., with being the brightest people on earth. So if you speak with Africans about enlightenment, they tend to get quite nervous, to put it mildly. The old enlightenment also created materialism. Of course, what I said about economics is all materialism, total rationalism, pure individualism, reductionism, and some other things. And the tragic is that for scientific publications, you have the peers and the peer reviewers go all for that. For everything has to be mathematical, which is crazy, but that's the old enlightenment. And we now say enlightenment requires balance, not dogmatism. So in the Western thinking, you see a lot of dogmatism. In Asia, balance represents wisdom. And in Black Africa, you have Ubuntu, which also is a different way of looking at each other and at what is good for you. So we need balance between humans and nature, balance between short-term and long-term. If you are hungry, you better eat now and not 30 years from now. But if you talk about climate, you better look at 30 years. So you have to balance that. Or balance between equity and incentives for achievement. This is the permanent trouble and fight between the left part of politics and the right part of politics. The left say equity and justice, and the right says, but there is nothing to distribute unless you have great achievement. Both are right. balance between state and markets. I mean, I believe I said about Adam Smith, there it was in good balance, but today's world markets are not. Balance between state and religion. I presume nobody in this room will want the Islamic State or the Christian state before the Reformation. It was, well, I don't say two bad words. Okay. Here we had that balance between innovation and tradition. It's extremely important. I mean, in America, it always has to be disruptive. Disruptive is better than innovation. But disruptive is crazy. I mean, I have read the original paper by Bauer and Christensen about the creation of the term disruptive technologies. And essentially it is Schumpeter, meaning destructive development. But people would never admit that. Okay, this is essentially the book which I have showed, and now I'm finished.
Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And now we'll have two discussants responding. And the first take will come from you, Professor Anna-Katharina Hornisch. You may do it there, or if you want to do it wherever you want. And just to remind you, she's the head of the DIE, the German Development Institute. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So Professor von Weizsäcker, thank you very much for the presentation, for reminding us of the origin of the Club of Rome and giving us this personal insight as well. I really want to thank you for this. You have spoken of a number of scares, and you have then looked at rotten political cultures, at growth versus efficiency, at the hierarchy of the SDGs, as well as you've asked whether we need a new enlightenment period. And I just want to add a few scares. I would like to reflect a little and ask a few questions and try to bring in some of the answers that are currently being formulated by policymaking. Now, we are, of course, currently in a situation where we are in a geopolitical crisis. We have a war in the midst of Europe, together with a climate crisis unfolding, with a looming nutrition crisis, as you described it earlier, also unfolding in large parts of Africa. We have autocratization processes that have gone on polarization processes all over the globe. By now, this year, the statistics say 70% of the world population live in autocracies. Last year, it was still 63%. So just to remind us of the developmental processes here. So we are in a situation that our Chancellor calls a turning point in history. One could even ask whether it's a double turning point in history, if you also think of the COVID-19 crisis in the past 2 years that has enabled, or during which high income economies, if we trust the numbers of the IMF, were able to mobilize around 16% of their GDP to stabilize their economies. Mid-income economies, so the big transition economies, around 3 to 6%, and low-income economies around 1.6%. So we here have a situation where we had not only faced and are not only facing, it's still not over, a health crisis, but of course an economic crisis that one could argue has destabilized also a number of institutional mechanisms in a range of countries, and created a ground where political crises, social crises become more likely. So these are the scares. They're very current, and I think take on or remind us of the urgency that you've also underlined, the urgency to act, and where you put a question mark on whether this action is actually unfolding, actually taking place. And I think that's a question mark many of us work on. Now, if I look at the limits to growth, I would argue, well, didn't this work on the one side create a discursive space and also unfold discursive power as well as decision-making power? And then third, shape institutional structures, shape global governance architecture within the field of environmental policy making, but also in the field of social and poverty related policy making, development policy making, if we also here think of the Agenda 2030. And fourth, doesn't it also stand for the encouragement of cultural change? And in many ways, it has facilitated all these four change processes. So on the discursive level, or by creating discursive spaces, by investing into decision making and building the institutional architecture, but then also pushing for cultural change. Now we could say, well, in 50 years, that's somehow not enough. But we could also say, well, change seems to take time. And if I only got 5 minutes, I realize. But if I then turn to today's policy making, and maybe just briefly towards the G7 presidency that is with Germany today, and that is challenged to define itself as a presidency that somehow still finds ways of considering the G7 as part of the G20. And that, of course, is a club governance format, and thus links in many ways maybe to the club that you were introducing to us. Then I would see three, I mean, there are more answers, but three main answers currently being discussed in the ministerials that I think are relevant for our discussions here today. One is, well, the realization that our multilateral institutions, our multilateral system is indeed in crisis. And not only since the 24th of February this year, but already since quite a number of years. And that asks or demands from us to find answers how to still enable global governance, despite the fact and despite the risk that Russia and also other actors can continue blocking global governance processes on the multilateral level. So the answer here is, of course, that is being attempted to form topic-related clubs, such as climate clubs, but underline that they're inclusive and that their formation is transparently done. Then one other answer being proposed is the instrument of the just energy transition partnerships, an instrument that was formed or first decided on in Glasgow last year, but that is being discussed now to be also widened and be decided on with India, Indonesia, Argentina, potentially besides South Africa. That was that had already agreed to it or entered the partnership agreement in Glasgow. So quite an interesting, I think, interesting proposals, both of them, to find ways of, yes, dealing with the climate crisis while acknowledging a crisis of multilateralism and a geopolitical crisis. And then, of course, we have the ongoing discussions with regard to sustainable finance and how to actually push for or develop further the financial instruments on the level of the World Bank, on the level of the IMF, etc., and regional banks to enable these just transitions, to enable the long-term stabilization of our climate by not going for further growth. Also, I don't think going for further efficiency, but by moving towards a phasing out and also not a phasing down that was decided on. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Now it's my turn to applaud.
Shall we continue with the second discussion?
Why not?
Then it's Professor Martin Keim's turn, and he's the department head at the Economic and Technological Change Department here at the ZDF, the Center for Development Research. Please, it's your turn.
Thanks, and thank you, Professor von Weizsäcker, for a very passionate and comprehensive lecture. I agree with most of the points you made, and I certainly share your concern that there's way too little and too slow action by policymakers to deal with the climate crisis. You highlighted climate, but obviously there are other urging environmental issues that need to be dealt with. One of the questions that I have, and I think it was perhaps a little bit too little emphasis on this, is that we are facing a world where about half of the world population lives in extreme or moderate poverty. We have obviously issues also with food insecurity. We have issues with health, and those are issues that you all put into those old growth agenda, where I would partly disagree. I share your view that obviously things will get worse when we let the climate heat up, and these people will be the most affected. So therefore, also from a poverty perspective, we obviously need to act quickly. But then on the other hand, we need to see that simply in quotation marks, simply preventing the climate crisis will not be enough in order to lift those people out of poverty and improve their standard of living. One of the other questions where I'm not exactly sure how to interpret is how do we get about this much needed efficiency gains? Is it, as I'm possibly getting, that we need much more of the state? Is it that we need much more idealism, or is it that we need much more entrepreneurship? And I think that obviously we need more state action in terms of effective regulation and fiscal incentives. There's no question. But then we probably also need to recognize that economic market principles are the most powerful institutions we have for broad-based behavioral change, because people and economic actors react to incentives and not because of altruism. I do think that we have some good examples where money is being made and can be made from efficiency gains. I mean, you mentioned solar energy. Green hydrogen is another example. E-mobility. I don't think that Elon Musk is an altruist. I mean, when we get incentives right, then probably we see a lot of the innovation that we would need to see. And I don't think that disruptive technology is a negative term. In my eyes, we need obviously disruptive technologies in order to get the fivefold and higher efficiency gains that you're asking for. So we need more of the Schumpeter type of destruction and not less. But that certainly doesn't mean that technology alone will solve it all. I mean, we obviously also need more sustainable consumption. Otherwise, we'll have the rebound effects that you didn't name, but were very implicit in what you were saying. I like your idea of the ping pong dynamics that could certainly play an important role in getting hold of some of these rebound effects that we need to avoid. In the public debate about sustainability, I think there are basically two camps that people mostly belong to. There's the camp that says all we need is technology, and the other camp that says all we need is sustainable consumption, meaning abstinence in the end to some degree. And I think both camps are wrong. Because we obviously need both technology and sustainable consumption alike. And this is not an either-or question. The global challenges are large enough that we need to pull all the strings, and especially against the background of many people being poor, still being poor, and hopefully not being poor in the future. What I really appreciate is your concrete suggestion to revive the idea of the climate budget approach. I like that idea. And I share your concern that obviously many countries won't be on board. But what does that tell us? I mean, can we really afford to wait for the smallest common denominator? Can we really wait for the slowest actors? I think we need to move forward. We need more political boldness, even it's a smaller club of countries willing to participate. Perhaps we will manage to bring others on board. We need more political boldness in order to save our precious little planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Quine. Do you want to respond a little, or should we ask more people? Otherwise, if you have a quick response, please go ahead.
You're the moderator.
Well, then I would like to hear your opinion before we maybe ask people in the chat, because I know there have been some questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Both very, very important. It is absolutely true that my emphasis on the future of developing countries was much too weak, absolutely. On the other hand, you understand more about that, including some people from developing countries who may be here in the room. So I hesitated to go into too many details. I mean, I've been working at the United Nations in New York for a while. And I have lots of friends who told me the same as you, more or less. And I have learned a lot. But for the troublesome discussion on climate, my current experience, I'm sorry to say, is negative. I was, as a delegate for UNEP, I had a function for UNEP at the East River discussions of the Agenda 2030. And my mandate was to emphasize sort of the Factor 5 story. And when I said so, I got furious responses from Brazil, from India, from Indonesia, from Nigeria, etc. They hated it. It's one of those intellectuals from the north who wants to tell us what we have to do better, you know, really angry. And it was all G77. There was no negative response from Europe, rich Asia, etc. They tend to hide behind poverty. Legitimately, of course. What you said is absolutely correct. But hiding behind the shield of poverty in order not to be involved in the world's big problems. The Jars is saying, no, we are too poor. No, it's not, none of our business. This is the language I kept hearing, which is selective. There are many fantastic other people. For instance, the other co-chair of the International Resource Panel was from India, Ashok Khosla, and he was the opposite of what I was now caricaturing. So he was absolutely fantastic, and I learned a lot from him. But I also learned some of those who said, and some of them, the voices were very strong in Glasgow, who said, well, you promised us $100 billion. Where is that money? And that was the end of the story. It was not the beginning of the story. And that is simply not good enough for one world. of course, in this book, I am heavily criticizing the North for colonialism and all the rest. But to work together is a different story. I mean, I was very happy and grateful you mentioned that in Glasgow, Argentina and Indonesia and a few other countries began to constructively work on strategies for getting the global South together for a constructive kind of agenda. That I found absolutely wonderful. I mean, I was not in Glasgow myself, but I heard about it, and what you said about it is correct. Then on your question, can we wait until all countries go for the budget approach? And the evident answer is no. The answer is what Olaf Scholz in his campaign last year said, we need a climate club. A club with Germany involved and a number of other rich countries and as many developing countries as possible. And when I spoke with his entourage people, I said, why not start with Costa Rica? Because Costa Rica is very strongly for international environmental policy. But that is one out of maybe a dozen developing countries who would say, yes, why not? And the idea of the budget approach is evidently to make developing countries richer once they begin to use that northern money, to use the cheap photovoltaics, to use the efficiency potential, etc., and thereby make money, even in the stock exchange, because all of that has some part in on the stock exchange. So we cannot wait until all agree. We have to, like in the United Nations, you always have certain clubs, and they can do more than just the General Assembly. Well, so much for the first time. I would like to mention still one thing, which is at the very last chapter of this book, which is essentially the idea of a deceased friend of mine, Gerhard Knies, who has worked for the Club of Rome for the so-called desert tech idea, which I found a very good one. And he said, the very idea of people like Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or Putin or so is basically wrong, that nations by definition are rivals against all each other. This is the philosophy of the 19th century, which has created endless wars, which is crazy. So we need, according to Gerhard Knies, to develop a nation understanding of what he calls not cooperation, cohabitation, where you have a ministry of cohabitation with the exclusive assignment of finding things that make your own country better and richer, and as many other countries as possible. this as simply a different idea from competition with the elbows all over the place. And this, I believe, is as ambitious as the New Enlightenment. A totally new understanding of the function of a nation state, which I believe people like Kofi Annan would have applauded immediately, but not always they do. I mean, Guterres, I think, would also agree.
But of course, they are not the heads of the world. They're just the UN Secretary Generals, and money and finances seem to be at the core of a lot of these questions that we're facing. And I heard from Sandra in the chat that there are several economics questions. Sandra, do you want to feed us some of them?
Yes, thank you very much, Anke, for giving the online audience the word. Thank you very much, Professor von Weizsäcker, for this really nice and inspiring talk. I received a lot of thank you notes from the audience and a lot of questions for which we won't maybe have time for all of the questions. I would start with a question by Lars Allerheiligen from GIZ, who asks, in the currently prevailing economic and financial system, economic growth represents an inherent element of the system, which is partly embedded in paradoxical cycles. Shouldn't macroeconomic dismantling of climate-damaging economic activity therefore be supported by clear framework conditions aimed in particular at restructuring the financial system?
Well, I cannot really answer this question properly. So I take the idle approach of quoting myself. I said some 20 years ago, when people were wondering why communism had collapsed, I said, oh, that's quite simple. They would not allow prices telling the economic truth. So that in the chilliest nights of Siberia, you had to open the windows because energy didn't cost a thing. And so it was always too hot. So that made the economic regime collapse, more or less. But my dear friends of the market ideology, the world, including you, will collapse unless we make prices telling the ecological truth. And the fact is that the so-called successful countries are those who have massively ignored the ecological truth. They were robbers to the resources of the earth. And the success story for a long period of time, last 10,000 years or so, was exactly that. That prices were never allowed to tell the ecological truth. And if that can be implemented politically, first by a club, perhaps, and then later into the world, we come closer to the answer to the wonderful question.
Thank you. Sandra, do you want to maybe add another question and then I'll ask into the room? And
yes.
Permission of Jakob, I would extend the time a little because we also started a bit later and
Sorry.
We've only just started, I feel. So.
Yeah, I think the second question by John Sears picks up the topic that has been in the room for a bit of a while of developing countries. So he asked, do any, so to say, poor economies and therefore possibly CO2 and greenhouse gas lighter economies maybe offer some models for the future? Is there untapped potential for learning for us in the sense that they could maybe help us think of models that are different from the model of OECD and industrializing countries that have lower climate impacts? So is there something we can use for better guidance here?
I fear acoustically and intellectually I didn't understand.
So the question is if in countries that are not industrialized as Germany, as Europe and so forth, if those countries could offer models, economic models, systemic models that we could adopt in the industrialized countries to go into a less climate impact system direction.
I think, yes, we can learn. I learned a lot from my friend Ashok Khosla from India, who had created the so-called development alternatives, in which he said, we accept for jobs people from all Indian castes, make sure that they love the work. We make village work not reasonable. Yes, attractive, of course, financially attractive. And one thing in particular he established in that area were so-called check dams, which would keep the water table a little higher. And that created a lot of, well, plants, animals, etc., so that the villages became richer. I mean, who in this world would think a small check dam makes you richer? Nobody would. And he said, yeah, let's try it. And it worked. So he got the village people together, and one sort of unintended positive side effect was that 20 years later, they made a quantitative study on the number of children of the young women. And it was 1 or 2. While those in the lowest class, who had not the privilege of Ashok's kind of development alternatives, had 5 or 6 and were getting poorer every year. So this is also similar to the idea of cohabitation, where people get richer by helping others. And I see a lot of that in African cultures, in Indian cultures, in Chinese cultures, where we Europeans have to learn from.
It's a very good way to keep the water table up. That's thinking in so many countries. Maybe we should get to the room. I'm sure there are also questions from the room.
Or critique, please.
Please. Okay, please switch on your mic. You see it when it's green, then you can speak.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Eva Jukana, and I'm also director here at the Center for Development Research. I really enjoyed your talk a lot. Also, the way you presented all your ideas and utopias as well. I have probably, well, I particularly liked your concept of enlightenment 2.0 and or 0. And I was thinking about our colleagues from Colombia, for example, but also from West Africa, whether they would be willing to have another updated version of the Enlightenment or not. I would like to discuss that with them next time. Well, they just arrived yesterday for a couple of workshops. I have one question and another comment. I didn't really get what the idea was about the empty world and the full world. The Anthropocene, of course, is also a concept that is highly controversial. I would rather talk about the Capitalocene, maybe. But of course, before humankind settled or came to this world, the world was not empty. And I think this is probably something we need to keep in mind, but maybe you can reflect on that a bit further. And then what raised my attention was the idea that, okay, when we want to phase out this growth model, we need to change the economy. We need to have a different economy. Yeah, idea of economy, a paradigm shift somehow. And I would like to, reflect a bit more on that. How would such a paradigm shift look like? And I think we cannot avoid to think about really a kind of also economic system change if we really want to make the world sustainable, not just for future generations, but also for the entire being that live in this world. Thank you.
On this last thing, a very, very good and difficult question. My answer would be that values, currencies, should be conceived of and created that are other than dollars or euros. The present economics is all about dollars. Also hypothetical dollars and lent dollars, etc., but always dollars. And this is too primitive. Here I'm coming back to the Ubuntu philosophy, where my value is rising if my company is joyful meeting me, regardless of the dollars. You know, and there is, of course, quantitative philosophy, psychology, which produces values and currencies above just money, which is fine. So you can build on that, but you have to also develop the incentive systems from the state, from the market, from the family, from the culture, that make it really fructuous and attractive to go for other values, but just the dollars. That's only the beginning of the answer. I mean, had I lived 10 more years and reflected on your question, I could come a little further.
Is there another question from the room? Otherwise, okay, two. How about two quick ones? United Nations University first, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Xiaomeng Zhen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Environment and Human Security of the United Nations University. It's a mouthful, our name. Thank you very much for the intriguing lecture. I think Anna Katerina mentioned cultural change, and Eva said paradigm shift. I think change is somehow all we want to have. Also in Glasgow, people talked about transformation and changing mindset. You suggested some pathways to more sustainability, which are all operating within the current system, which is the capitalism system. I read recently a book which showcased some case studies in the USA and even in Germany. In the US, more than 60% of the people are against capitalism. And in Germany, even 72% of the people want to change the capitalism system. So do you think that we can re-establish the balance as you talked about without changing the system? Because I think we do need a system change to re-establish that balance, because we are far away from the balance right now. You said you don't like disruptive things, but I think we do need something disruptive. I'm thinking, do you think it would be a meaningful pathway to focus on human flourishment instead of focusing on growth? Like you mentioned, Ubuntu, also Buen Vivir, these concepts are all focusing on human flourishment. Do you think that could be a viable concept for the future? Thank you.
I think it's a great idea. The trouble is, I believe, that the ruling economists would say, you want to go back to communism. This has failed dramatically. Why should we now make the big disruptive step away from the success story? This is the typical way I have experienced when talking with economists. And I'm not saying they are right. Your question is right, but my answer is weak. We need probably good areas, good countries, good villages, demonstrating that the changed mindset towards more well, productive, constructive, certainly not destructive success stories. So I only can return it to the audience that each of you can invest imagination into answering your question.
So returning the task to us, it's very clever. And I'll give you the last word or the last question for this evening, because we're already a bit too late, but please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think it's a similar or follow-up question, Professor von Weizsäcker. Thanks a lot for your great talk. I'm Tina Beuchelt. I'm also a scientist here at CEF. And I appreciated that you really clearly pointed out the urgency to act on climate change, and also that not much or not enough is happening. And you mentioned many solutions. I'm still unclear actually really how we get there. And that is, I think, the biggest question I currently always struggle with is how to achieve in the short time available the system change you also demanded in your talk. Like, how do we achieve this fast and maybe even disruptive change in politics, in economics, and in the related power structures? And with that, the second question, is it maybe time to change our strategies, especially our strategies as scientists, moving rather from talks and the typical science policy communication into civil disobedience? Do you think there's time for it? Is it even a moral duty for scientists? Thanks.
Let me give you sort of two answers. One is Greta Thunberg, whom I personally got to know, did some civil obstruction and has helped getting thousands, perhaps millions of young people to engage for something they in the past had more or less ignored. So that is fantastic. On the other hand, Anna-Katarina Honic asked this question about the current political crisis of Ukraine, etc., and new famine and what have you. That should be handled properly. Of course, that is one thing, like giving money, but that's not good enough. And shouting against Putin doesn't solve any problem either. There, I believe it will be unavoidable, necessary to have a new understanding of, well, cohabitation philosophy, of long-term thinking, of friendship thinking, of rules like criminal law, which don't allow certain well, actions. So enlarge the pot of not allowed action. Of course, the present young generation, according to opinion polls, are in their majority on the side of the FDP in Germany. Because freedom, freedom, freedom is what we want, you know, no state. This is, I mean, I know that from America, but that is wrong. When I speak with pupils at school, I don't accept their way of praising freedom. We have so much freedom in our country and essentially in Western Europe that we must accept obligations. We must accept an enlarged pot of forbidden things. Unless we do that, the future of humanity and of Europe and of the youth, etc., will be very, very bleak. It's not a good answer.
It leaves us with a lot of obligations. But it seems that there's still a lot to discuss. If you want to have a last word that is a little bit less bleak, we're very... So we will try to find the solutions to all the questions that you mentioned and the many more that we still have. But first of all, thank you very much for tonight.